The morning mist clung to the ancient stone walls of Buckingham Palace as a convoy of gleaming black vehicles swept through the ornate gates, their tires humming softly against the cobblestones. On the lead car, small diplomatic flags fluttered, signaling the arrival of a distinguished delegation, a group of high-ranking American military officers, visiting London for the annual NATO Strategic Leadership Summit. Among them, Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Hayes of the United States Marine Corps stepped out with a sharp snap of his boots. His uniform was immaculate, every ribbon and medal meticulously placed, each one a testament to decades of hardened combat experience. Yet as his sharp eyes surveyed the palace grounds, the perfectly trimmed gardens, the time-worn grandeur of the palace, and the stoic figures of the royal guard standing at rigid attention, a flicker of impatience crossed his face. He adjusted his cap with a swift, almost dismissive motion. "All this pageantry," he muttered under his breath to Major Davis, his aide-de-camp. "A glorified meeting dressed up in fairy tale costumes. We could have hosted this at the Pentagon and actually gotten something done." Major Davis offered a cautious nod, sensing the brewing storm behind Hayes's cool exterior. His attention, however, drifted to a figure nearby, Sergeant William Barrett of the Queen's Guard, standing motionless, clad in the iconic scarlet tunic and towering bearskin hat. Every detail of Barrett's appearance, the polished buttons, the gleaming rifle, the unwavering thousand-yard stare, seemed meticulously crafted to project both discipline and history. Hayes's gaze lingered on Barrett, his lips curling into a faint smirk. He saw not a soldier, but a mannequin dressed for tourists, a relic of outdated traditions that had no place in the brutal reality of modern warfare. His fingers twitched slightly, an unconscious sign of the restless energy that crackled just beneath the surface. To him, every second spent in ceremonial stillness was a second wasted from tactical readiness, from honing the instincts that kept soldiers alive on real battlefields. The palace tour coordinator, a composed man named Edward Fleming, approached the group with a diplomatic smile that barely masked the tension he sensed. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you would kindly follow me, our schedule is quite precise today." But as the delegation moved forward, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes lingered, his boots pivoting toward Sergeant Barrett with deliberate intent. A whisper of curiosity, perhaps even challenge, gleamed in his eyes. He was not content to simply tour the palace, he intended to test it. And in doing so, he would spark a confrontation that would be remembered far beyond the misty gardens of Buckingham Palace, a clash not just of men, but of two deeply different ideas about discipline, service, and the true heart of military tradition. As the group proceeded through the palace courtyard, the grandeur of Buckingham's historic walls soaring around them, Hayes's voice grew louder, his disdain less hidden. "Mannequins," he scoffed, loud enough for several nearby guards, and a few wary palace aides, to hear. "Dressed up like toy soldiers. How can anyone expect these statues to hold a line if a real fight broke out?" A few heads in the delegation turned uneasily. Major Davis shot him a warning glance, but Hayes barely noticed. His sharp tongue had been honed on tougher crowds than this. To him, traditions were fine for parades, not for a battlefield where a split second decided life or death. The tour coordinator, Edward Fleming, cleared his throat politely. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes," he began, with a diplomatic air polished by years of dealing with difficult dignitaries, "the Queen's Guard are fully trained soldiers. Many have seen active combat in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other deployments. Their ceremonial duties are only one aspect of their service." But Hayes only chuckled dryly. He motioned toward Sergeant Barrett, who remained as motionless as a marble statue under his bearskin hat. "Standing there stiff as a board won't help you when rounds start flying," Hayes said. "Discipline's one thing, but fighting requires instincts, not posing." Several members of the American delegation shifted uncomfortably. Across the courtyard, a few guards exchanged glances, but not a single face flinched. Not a muscle moved. It was as if Hayes's insult simply bounced off them, unheard, and somehow, that only fueled his irritation. Hayes leaned closer to Davis and muttered, "I'd bet my career half these boys would freeze the moment they heard a shot fired." Unbeknownst to him, Sergeant Barrett, still standing at attention, had caught every word. Beneath the solemn expression, behind the steely blue eyes that stared ahead, a quiet fire was starting to burn, because the Queen's Guard might have been trained to endure the jeers of tourists, but disrespect from a fellow soldier, a brother in arms, was something different entirely, and the day's events were about to take a turn neither side had anticipated. Ignoring the subtle warnings from both the tour coordinator and his own officers, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes decided to push the matter further. He slowed his steps as the delegation passed Sergeant William Barrett, a tall, broad-shouldered guard whose polished boots seemed riveted to the cobblestones. Hayes's boots scraped deliberately close to Barrett's, almost brushing against them, a clear breach of decorum. "Tell me, soldier," Hayes drawled mockingly, his voice dripping with contempt. "Do they teach you anything beyond standing still and looking pretty?" Barrett, still as stone, gave no response. His jaw remained set, his eyes fixed on the invisible point in the distance. The American officer smirked. He circled around the guard like a wolf testing the limits of a chained dog. The delegation had paused, sensing the tension thickening the air. Some exchanged anxious glances, but no one dared intervene. Hayes stepped even closer, his metals clinking faintly as he leaned in. "You wouldn't last 5 seconds on a real battlefield," he sneered, voice low but cutting. Then, in a move that drew sharp gasps from both his own team and the palace staff, Hayes jabbed 2 fingers into Barrett's shoulder, a light but unmistakable poke. The courtyard seemed to hold its breath. Still, Barrett didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even twitch. It was a display of self-discipline so complete. It was almost inhuman. His towering figure remained frozen, as if he were carved from the very stone of Buckingham itself. Hayes stepped back, perhaps half expecting the guard to explode in fury. When he didn't, the colonel chuckled again, but this time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his laugh. A faint realization that he might have underestimated the man before him. Major Davis, face tense with barely concealed fury, finally spoke under his breath, "Sir, you're way out of line." Hayes waved him off, but something had shifted in the air, because Sergeant William Barrett's silence wasn't weakness, it was a warning, the calm before a storm, and Hayes, blind in his arrogance, was walking straight into it. The courtyard of Buckingham Palace, though steeped in centuries of royal tradition, had rarely witnessed a standoff quite like this. A visiting American officer, proud and aggressive, standing face to face with a silent sentinel clad in scarlet and bearskin, whose stillness was more threatening than any shouted command. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Hayes scoffed under his breath, stepping back from Sergeant William Barrett. Though his poke had gone unanswered, the tension that lingered in the air was unmistakable. What Hayes didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was who exactly he was provoking. Sergeant William Barrett was no ordinary guardsman. Before donning the ceremonial uniform, he had spent 12 harrowing years as an elite infantryman in the British Army, Afghanistan, Iraq, Africa. He had seen the very worst of mankind, had fought through hellholes where the sun itself seemed to scorn the earth, decorated 3 times for valor under fire, recipient of the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Barrett was not just a soldier, he was a symbol of unbreakable discipline and quiet ferocity. When he volunteered for the Royal Guard, many wondered why a hardened warrior would choose to stand sentry at royal gates, but for Barrett, guarding symbols mattered as much as fighting wars. He understood that strength was not just measured on battlefields, but in every silent moment when eyes of the world were watching, waiting for a sign of weakness, and weakness was something Barrett did not know. In the moments following Hayes's provocation, Barrett's mind remained as still as his body. He did not see Hayes. He saw the endless sand of Helmand Province. He saw the bloodied comrades he had carried on his back through sniper fire. He heard again the deafening crack of enemy mortars splitting the night sky, and he remembered the one lesson war had carved into his bones. True strength is never loud. Hayes, however, mistook Barrett's silence for cowardice. Typical, he muttered, loud enough for the delegation to hear. All show, no substance. At that moment, Major Davis, second in command of the American delegation, clenched his fists. He had tried, Lord knew he had tried, to keep Hayes in check. But now he saw it was futile. "Colonel," Davis hissed, his voice strained. "Stand down," but Hayes ignored him. He turned away from Barrett with a dismissive wave, addressing his delegation with a theatrical flourish. "This," he declared, gesturing grandly to the motionless guardsmen lined along the courtyard, "is what centuries of inbreeding get you." Statues in red coats, several of the Americans chuckled nervously. They knew Hayes's reputation for brashness, but today he was dancing dangerously close to international disgrace, and unbeknownst to Hayes, palace security, and worse, senior British officers, had begun to take notice. Sergeant Barrett, meanwhile, continued to stand unmoving, but inside him. A decision had been made, not of anger. Barrett had long ago mastered his anger. No, it was a decision of duty. The Queen's Guard, though often dismissed as ceremonial by outsiders, held strict protocols regarding breaches of their post. And if a member of the public, or a foreign guest, interfered with their duties, they were authorized to act, swiftly, decisively, publicly, if necessary. In slow, deliberate motion, Barrett's gloved hand moved to the heavy bayonet fixed to his rifle. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The ripple passed through the watching delegation. Even Hayes faltered slightly, noticing the guard's hand shift. "Careful now," someone whispered behind him. "You pushed too far," muttered another. Barrett's hand did not grip the bayonet as a threat, it was a reminder, a warning encoded in steel. "You are treading dangerous ground." Hayes, to his credit or folly, straightened his spine and faced Barrett fully once more. "Go on then," he sneered, raising his arms mockingly. "Do something." The world seemed to narrow down to the space between them. Barrett's voice, when it finally came, was low, steady, and carried the weight of 1,000 battles. "In the name of Her Majesty the Queen," he said, every syllable razor-sharp, "you are ordered to step away from the guard." It was the first time Barrett had spoken, and the authority in his tone struck harder than any shout. Hayes blinked, thrown off by the sudden shift. For the first time, a seed of doubt crept into his chest. He laughed again, but the sound was brittle. "Or what?" he barked, half to Barrett, half to the gathering crowd. You'll what? March me to the dungeon?" Barrett took one step forward, a single, thunderous step, and snapped his rifle into position with military precision. The sound of the rifle locking into place echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. Hayes stumbled back instinctively, his bravado cracking. Major Davis seized the opportunity. "Colonel Hayes, sir," he barked sharply, stepping between the two men. "You are in violation of palace protocols and international military decorum. I am relieving you of duty." Now, Hayes, red-faced and fuming, opened his mouth to argue, but the sight of multiple palace guards quietly stepping closer, and the flash of cameras from tourists now filming the incident, froze the words in his throat. He stood, chest heaving, glowering at Barrett, but Barrett had already returned to his original stance, rifle vertical, boots planted, gaze fixed far beyond Hayes as if he no longer existed, as if he had never been worth noticing at all. Hayes, his pride wounded and judgment clouded by rage, refused to let the matter die. Brushing off Major Davis's restraining hand, he took 2 bold steps back toward Sergeant Barrett. The American delegation froze. Even the tourists seemed to sense that whatever came next might tip the scales from spectacle into scandal. With a voice sharp enough to cut stone, Hayes barked across the courtyard. "Sergeant, as a commissioned officer of a NATO member nation, I order you to salute." His words rang out, harsh and jarring against the hushed reverence of Buckingham Palace. Somewhere among the British officers observing from the shadows, a murmur of disbelief rippled. This was no longer rudeness. It was a diplomatic incident in the making. Hayes's face burned red with fury, his finger jabbing at Barrett like a sword. He invoked NATO protocols, citing joint military courtesy rules that obligated soldiers of allied nations to recognize the rank of visiting officers. To Hayes, it was a final blow, a way to force submission, to claw back dignity from the cold silence that had so thoroughly stripped it away. But Hayes, for all his bluster, had once again underestimated the man before him. Sergeant Barrett did not flinch, he did not speak. Instead, he performed the ultimate act of defiance within the rigid discipline he lived by. He ignored him. Barrett's gaze remained forward, unmoving, as if Hayes were no more significant than the pigeons fluttering across the cobblestones. Because within the walls of Buckingham Palace, under the sovereign's watch, Barrett owed allegiance first and foremost to his post, his queen, and the sacred duty entrusted to him. Foreign ranks, foreign rules, even under NATO, could not supersede that. The silence that followed Hayes's command was deafening. Major Davis, seeing disaster unfurling like a slow-motion train wreck, finally stepped in fully. He moved between Hayes and Barrett, planting himself firmly. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes," Davis said, voice low but fierce, "you are ordered to stand down immediately. You are in breach of international protocol, of palace security regulations, and," he paused, for emphasis, "you are humiliating yourself and your country." Hayes sputtered, his mouth working furiously for a retort, but none came. Barrett remained a statue, an immovable sentinel in scarlet and steel. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks again and see you in the next one.